Welcome to the first lecture of the 2012-2013 Forum Lecture Series. I'd like to welcome you to the Barney Dance and Theatre. And first of all, tonight I'm going to thank our founding sponsors. When was that? 15 or so years ago, we had a lunch with a certain individual called Barry Hoban. Some of you might remember him. And we talked about starting or refounding the Forum Lecture Series at Carleton University and bringing it back to its the status that it had during the mid-1980s. And thanks to Barry's tireless efforts and the efforts of his colleagues, I think we've achieved that task. So it also, as well as Barry Hoban and Associates, I would also like to recognize Merkley Supply, IBI Group, Trinity Development Group, and Charlesfort Development Group. Those are our founding sponsors. And again, they've been with us this whole time and have built substantial endowment that will ensure that Forum continues to survive into the future. I was wondering if you could help me in thanking them. The lecture series this year is quite diverse, beginning with this evening's very exciting presentation. On the 22nd of October, Emmanuel Cambarel and Tania Concho will be joining us. That will be co-sponsored by the French Embassy. On the 5th of November, the architectural critic Paul Goldberger, New York Times, The New Yorker, also author of a book called Why Architecture Matters. Next semester, January, Eva Jurikna, who's a Czech-born architect practicing in London. She'll be talking about her recent work in the Czech Republic and her award there. On February the 8th, Kenneth Frampton will be joining us. And on 11th March, Russell Acton from Acton Austria Architects in Vancouver. And Russell is a Carleton alumni. So again, I think it's quite a diverse and quite an interesting group of speakers, and I hope to see you all at the National Art Gallery for the continuation of the Forum Lecture Series this year. So after tonight, all lectures will be at the National Art Gallery. So with that, I would like to introduce Richard Smith, who is here from the Ottawa Regional Society of Architects, and he's just going to talk to you briefly about Architecture Week. Richard.
Good evening. Mr. Alex Rankin, Mr. Raymond Mariyama, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Ottawa Regional Society of Architects, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone here this evening. My name is Richard Smith, architect with HOK Architects in Ottawa and chair of Architecture Week 2012. I'm thrilled to announce this year's kickoff to Architecture Week, starting with this very special event tonight. Each year, ORSA volunteers launch this festival to promote architecture to the public and unite the design community. This year, the event will feature lighting design and its integral relationship with architecture, showcasing Ottawa's most celebrated lighting designers, artists, and architects. The Lunchbox Lecture series starts up again from Tuesday through Thursday from 12 to 1 p.m. with speakers such as Phil Gabriel of Gabriel McKinnon, Bruce Micklejohn of Martin Conboy Lighting, Louise Lalande of Co-Creations, and architecture student Samuel Alcino-Brassard. Tomorrow evening, starting at 6 p.m., we are very happy to have Paul Mercier of Lighting Design Innovations, who's traveled from New York to be speaking to us on the topic of true integration in architecture, lighting in architecture. Wednesday evening, Montreal's Gilles Alpin from Éclairage Public will be speaking about lighting strategies for large public spaces, such as Le Quartier des Spectacles and Le Vieux Port de Montréal. And Thursday is our most eventful time of the week, which includes a building tour of the Ottawa Convention Centre, led by Bruce Micklejohn of Martin Conboy Lighting. And later that evening, there will be a temporal lighting installation by Gabriel McKinnon Lighting Designers, forming the backdrop to the Supporters' Night, and the OAA annual visit with President Sheena Sharp. By Friday, we are very pleased to be screening Coast Modern, which is a new Canadian documentary on West Coast modernism that's having tremendous success across the country. And this will be followed by a film production by Phil Gabriel that includes a montage of great lighting design scenes in film. Over the weekend, we'll have the inaugural Ottawa CAGBC Green Bike Tour of Ottawa architecture. And that afternoon, there will be building tours of the Architecture Week venue itself, St. Bridget's. Later that evening, we'll have a pub crawl through the market. At week's end, the Kids Clinic returns and promises to be yet another huge success, starting Sunday morning at the Canadian Museum of Science and Technology. And throughout the whole week, however, you'll enjoy interior and exterior lighting installations that will be illuminating St. Bridget's, including a piece by Andrew O'Malley that will allow the public to control the lighting configurations of St. Bridget's facade from their smartphones. All of these events and so much more can be found on our website at architecture-week.com. And unless noted otherwise, all the events will be held at St. Bridget's at the corner of St. Patrick Street and Cumberland in the Market. We really do hope to see you at this year's festival. The ORSA committee has been working tirelessly all year planning it, and we're so very excited to share with you one of our best architecture weeks yet. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. We're very happy that we were able to be part of Architecture Week this year with this inaugural lecture. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce Mr. Tony Griffiths, architect. I'm sure, again, not a stranger to anyone in this room, longtime partner with Griffiths, Rankin, and Cook, and he will do our formal introduction this evening.
Thank you, Steve. This shouldn't take more than about 45 minutes, I think. Ladies and gentlemen and honored guests, I'd first like to acknowledge the presence of the Deputy Head of Mission of the Embassy of Japan, Mr. Fumo Yawata, and the First Secretary, Mr. Noriaki Samuto. Thank you. Just in case you don't know who I am, my name is Tony Griffiths. I'm the retired partner and close friend of Alex Rankin, and I'm also, I should confess, a close friend of Raymond Mariyama's, both of whom I admire greatly as architects and as people in their own right. It has been my great pleasure to know and to work closely with Alex, Rankin, and Raymond for many years. And in fact, in Alex's case, it has been many, many, many years, because Alex and I worked together in London in the early 1960s. In the distinguished office of Powell and Moyer in London. And then we re-met in the office of Murray and Murray, thank you, Tim, in the front row, where we got to know each other even better after a break of a few years. And then we formed our practice of Griffiths, Rankin, Cook, and had a wonderful time here in Ottawa. Now, designing and building an iconic building of national importance is not an easy task. But I'm delighted to be able to tell you that this commission has created not only a building of great architectural distinction, has also resulted in a true and lasting friendship between Raymond and Alex, which is not always the outcome in such team circumstances, which you will well appreciate. So I must confess I'm a little bit jealous of Raymond and Alex's relationship. But it is very nice and it's very touching, and I think it's wonderful that through the intense stress of putting together a building of this nature, of this complexity, that friendship has been the great outcome of this, as well as the building. I'd like to take this moment to express my personal thanks and gratitude to all the members of the large and complex team who worked so well together to produce on time and on budget this wonderful building, which in my opinion is one of Canada's most distinguished pieces of architecture. I will end by offering my sincere congratulations to Alex and Raymond and the team who have together given us all this great building, a building of which all Canadians can be justifiably proud, and a building which has become a symbol of the sacrifice made by so many Canadians in the interest of peace and freedom throughout the world. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Raymond Mariyama and Alex Rankin.
I apologize first. Is this on? I hope it is. I'm somewhat incapacitated to my normal old-fashioned self with oxygen and stuff, and it affects my voice. So I'm going to have to speak less than normal, which is very difficult for an Irishman, I can tell you. So I'm going to say an introduction, and then I'm going to hand this over to Raymond to make the bulk of the presentation. We have a PowerPoint, and I think you'll find it quite enjoyable with respect to showing how the concept and the design of this building actually came about. There's no point in talking about the building. We used to do that, but it's all here. The catalyst for all of this, I was thinking about it, was actually Carleton University. The reason at Carleton, Raymond's two sons who are architects, two of his sons who are architects, I had the joy of teaching. I've been an adjunct professor there since before 1980, and that's one way that I first got connected with Raymond. A second was the RAIC, which we both love very much, the National Institute, the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. And we went to annual conventions. We learned to dance, and in those early days, it was like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers type of dancing. As we get older, it's a bit of a slow down process, but there we go. But then Raymond called me one day and said, I hear that there's going to be a war museum. It's going to be out on a site near the Aviation Museum. And would you like to go in with us? And I was floored. I mean, one of Canada's great gold medalists actually phoned me and asked if I'd, and I said, do you want me to carry your bags, do this and that? No, this is an equal joint venture, and you're going to have to work just as hard as I am from the very beginning. And so we went to the site, all that, and lo and behold, that was going to happen when suddenly our submission, which was carefully put together. Now, all you architects here know how complex it is to put a big submission together with a total team, just like Tony referred to, and all the answers to the questions. Unfortunately, it landed in the government's hands 2 minutes late. So that was the end of that. We were floored. Anyway, along comes Jean Chrétien, who at the time was Prime Minister, and he made a magnificent gesture. He took it off the site there and put it onto this site here in order that it could see Parliament and be part of the Confederation route. So we were very determined not to be late with the submission. I think that's correct.
Well, we drove it in.
Yes.
So we were at least half an hour before the deadline.
Yes.
But what Alec hasn't told you is how we got together, really. As he mentioned, he was a professor who worked with our two sons. Actually, more so with our younger son, Adrian. And so I told Alex when I first met him that if our son, Adrian, doesn't turn out to be a reasonable architect, it's his fault. And so that began our friendship. And I did tell Alex that one day a project is going to come along that will be perfect for us to work together on. And when the War Museum came, that felt like the right time. So, as Alex said, I phoned and asked him to do a duet. And that was the beginning.
Yes.
And we went to the interview, and we were convinced, at that time, because we worked maybe twice as hard on the second proposal, and we were absolutely convinced that nobody else could do this except us. So that began. And so maybe we could get into the slides and as Alex has sort of mentioned, it was the selection process was very interesting, and we had our first downfall, and Alex knows that I just about cried. Then when we went to the interview for the second site, it was a very complicated sort of a list of requirements, but we were convinced that we were going to do it. And the requirement was that we were to do 3 schemes, which was going to be put on a national website to be judged by the public.
These schemes had to be to what they call a Class C, which is a full sketch design, just before you start working drawing. So that was part of the commission.
But in order to get there, those who are interested in process in architecture will be interested in knowing that we did 65 schemes with a little model of each one. And each one has a theme and a direction which it could go. And so we have multiple choices. And this was reduced down to 12. And we had the client, the committee, look at the 12 and said, okay, you choose 3. And we took those 3 and made an elaborate sort of a presentation, which was put on the...
I have to add that the 3 they picked, they said, would be 3 very different ones, totally different, not like the 3 better ones, 3 completely different approaches.
Well, so we did the 65 scheme, as I mentioned, and then we reduced that to 12, and then down to 12, which was exposed to the client body, and they picked the 3. And of course, they wanted 3 totally different approaches. And the national website was interesting. I did mention at that time that if the Canadian public said, we're not interested in a war museum, well, we detest what you guys are doing, and if that percentage of refusal was more than 10%, I would leave the project. But fortunately, only 4% thought, what good is a war museum? And
the person in charge of that whole process was Minister of Heritage at the time, Sheila Cox, who was very dedicated to the whole idea of opening it all up right across Canada, particularly for all the veterans, in order that they could participate.
Well, the interesting thing about this was I personally insisted that we go across Canada, although we had very little time, to listen to what the public input was. And if it wasn't for that trip, together with Joe Gertz, the director at the time, the museum would have been completely sort of different. And it would have followed the, what do you call it, the program that was given to us.
Yeah.
We threw out the program and said, what the Canadians are saying and what you're telling us to build are totally different. So we redesigned the program. And of the 3, 2 of them were very close in sort of ranking. Both of them were around 31%. One was a little more than the other. The third one was about 22%. And so that was rejected very quickly. And looking at the schedule, we started the project in November 2001. And the substantial completion had to be November of 2004, which was a very short time, which included research as well as redefining the program and so on. And the opening was an absolute must. It had to be the 60th anniversary of the VE Day. There were a lot of discussion about whether it should be VE Day or VJ Day or so on, but that was established as the date, and that included all the exhibits.
The reason the building had to be finished earlier than the May was in order that a separate contract for all the exhibition work, which most of you have probably walked through and seen, or seen parts of it because it's very rich in content, that all had to be done before the May. So we had to have the building substantial for the November. So that's why the dates.
The mandate, and at the same time, it was to be a national museum and to remember, to preserve the history, and to educate. But I guess I personally felt that it had to be more than these. It felt really falling short of what really a war museum should be. The inspiration that started to move us, well, there's a multitude of inspiration, and the first was, we want to sort of listen to the voices of Canadians and learn from that. And
I have to interrupt to just say, at some of these meetings, you'd have 15 or 20 people whom we'd never met before, who had been helping with the whole war museum to be developed and so on. And they were expressing their ideas about what they felt a war museum should be. So they typically, a number of them, would ask either Raymond and I, or both, but what do you want the War Museum to be? To which Raymond very carefully nudged my arm and said, we aren't going to tell you anything, we want to hear. We're not going to say a word until we've gone through all this process. I always remember that.
Well, and the public input made all the difference. For example, a lady said to us, going to war is like going to the depths of hell to resurrect the soul. Well, you wouldn't hear a statement like that coming from a man. And so there were a lot of differences between women and men in giving us the input. Another woman said, outstanding architect will give up part of his ego to embrace the ideals of the country. Those are very important things, and I think you'll see part of that sort of input appearing design-wise, and I'll try and point out some of them. The men talked a lot about the good times, the bad times, and also, as many said, very pragmatic terms, make it cheap, but make it good, Well, one of the important sort of idea was ordinary Canadians doing extraordinary things. The Canadians, I really got to appreciate the Canadians at the time because they were doing extraordinary things, and and at the same time there was modesty. And these were a lot of the things that the Canadians were doing. And the War Museum, I don't know if you know this, there are absolutely remarkable set of paintings here. And some of the people, back in year 2001, estimated that the amount of paintings here is equivalent to about $1 billion worth.
It makes me feel proud as a Canadian to say that at the opening in 2005, there was the director of the Australian War Museum and there was the director of the British War Museum present here in Ottawa. And they were blown away by the quality of art that Canada has collected for the War Museum. They said that their collection isn't up to the level and standard that Canada has. And I just think, as a Canadian, it makes you feel something special.
And for example, Colville, there are 400 Colvilles in this collection. if you can imagine
Yep.
what's. And many of these inspired us in terms of the architectural design. You'll see this one particularly clearly in our design. Bimini Bridge. And we found, this gentleness, openness, modesty as a very important element to start sort of making our minds and heart move on the design. The Canadian landscape was another inspiration. If you scan across the country from the east to the west coast, it's an amazing variation. Like Ontario, Pembroke, you don't find many sort of inspiration like this. The foothill, the sort of the mid, Canada, and the mountains, and some of the coloration of our country. And Ottawa is a very sort of one of my favorite cities, and it gave us a lot of inspiration. And if you look at this slide, if you close your eyes to the right-hand side, Ottawa looks quite different on the left hand, and it looks pretty mundane looking at the right-hand side. The site, the final site that was chosen is this area here. And the Parliament precinct is over there. And what inspired us with some of the natural condition on the site. And here's the river's edge with natural plants. And I love the grass. And that started to make our mind tick along in a certain direction. And then from the site, you could see the Peace Tower. And if you look at the Ottawa River, and if you look at the sunset, the sun sets on the Quebec side, one part of the year, and it sits on the Ontario side, in other part of the season. But at equinox, it sits right in the middle of the river. Now, the site is absolutely, wonderful site, except it has so many challenges. We were told that 1 to 800 flood condition would wipe out the museum, or it'll get flooded. So that was a very important consideration. The planning was done in such a way, and I'm putting this very crudely, but we said, we got to protect everything, the artifacts. And so the building is designed with 2 levels of parking. And I said, well, it's better to flood the basement and flood the cars than the artifacts. And the contaminated soil, every bit of that soil was removed from the site. And fortunately, the rock ledge is not too far down. And it was both, it was wonderful on one side, and it was not a wonderful thing, because we didn't want to sort of blast the rocks and create a kind of an ecological sort of imbalance.
As you know from Raymond, budget was very tight, and as it is in any major building. But one of the factors was with this rocking excavation, we found that there was a very high water table. And that meant that the parking garage would either have to be tanked at great expense, which we were told would have to come out of the building budget, or, as Raymond said, cars, who cares? Why don't you just let it go? I mean, who cares if the cars rust? What matters is the works of art and everything in the building. Yeah. I always remember that. Yeah. And you said it with such strength. They said, well, okay.
Well, at the beginning, the client didn't take that nicely. And as you know, Ottawa is in an earthquake zone, and that's why we didn't want to blast anything. And so the museum sits on the rock ledge, and like the Centurion, the tanks and all that, with all that weight, sits right on the rock, so that unless the rock moves, the museum will be, the tanks will be all sort of clear. Well, the poems and like this one, I Died in Hell, they call it Passchendaele. And Passchendaele was a modest little town and looked like this. Within a few months, there was nothing except this. Well, what was inspiring is that nature comes back. And it tends to soften things. The grass grows. And Beaumont Hummel, this is Beaumont Hummel. And it was interesting because another young lady said, I was out to Beaumont Hummel, and I walked across the field. And when I got to the other side, I looked down, my shoes were covered with red mud. And I said to myself, if I had walked across after the battle, it would have been all blood. And this is when 700 people, men from Newfoundland, when Newfoundland was not part of Canada, fought and were wounded. 700 virtually wiped out the whole group. So the word regeneration started to prick us a lot. And I did tell the client that we're not going to talk about architecture, we're going to maybe talk about landscape, but not about architecture. And I also said that this building is not going to be beautiful in a conventional sense. It's going to move people, but not to say, oh, this is a beautiful building. So the idea of survival, rebirth, hybridization, and hope start to emerge in our vocabulary. So the architectural concept was regenerative landscape. And I don't think we really talked about architecture at all.
No. I have to say that to do something for your nation is a great privilege. And Raymond never forgot that point. When people would typically ask for various things, he'd say, well, I'll have to think about this. Alec, you and I have to talk, so on and so forth. And if we believe this is right for Canada, then we'll do it. If it isn't right for Canada, we should fight hard not to do it. And that was a standing we had together all along through this whole process. So that was a privilege to work with Raymond, and privilege to see his strength for always realizing why it is you're doing what you're doing. Yeah. Never forgetting it, never caught in the bureaucratic process.
Because, think about it, the importance of Canada as a nation of the future. We're not there, absolutely not there yet. We don't recognize the North, we don't recognize the Arctic until we do and see ourselves as a total nation, not, 5% of the nation as, it's good enough. It never will be. And hope is a very important word for Canadians. We haven't conquered the whole sort of, there are parts in Canada that man has not walked. And this is an area that one has to be very careful about, in the mind as well as the heart. And poems like Carl Sandburg's Grass, just have a quick read. It's grass, but the meaning of the grass. Have you had enough time? Well, these are a couple of sketches. This is what Alec did.
Well, I have a little bit to inject here. We were doing all this thinking, and we were interviewing and talking to people of various levels, all sorts of things, and then we had to get going and do things, because this time is very short. So Raymond phoned up and said, Alec, have you done any sketches yet? Any conceptual ideas, thinking from all the talking we're doing? What is your thought on paper as an architect? And I said, I haven't done any. I assume you're the gold medalist, with all these great buildings. And he said, no, remember I told you, this is a joint venture. You're going to work hard from day one. So I suggest we meet 2 weeks from now, and you have sketches and I'll have sketches, and we'll critique and discuss these things together. I'll never forget that.
It was a good start. This was my sketch. And my sketch was about sound. It wasn't about buildings or the shape of things to come, but this was a sketch of a sound I heard 60 years earlier when I was a 12-year-old boy up in the Rockies. And because it was during the wartime, I imagined, at night, hearing the two sides, my image was about World War I. One side, the soldiers are tired at night, the guns are a bit silent, but there is a breeze blowing, and these soldiers are saying, for God's sake, I wish this were over, and we could go home. And that sound that I heard in the Rockies is the sound that came back to me, and I started to sketch this. Well, it had to have an ecological foundation, of course, and reduction of energy consumption. We even used old equipment to save some of the cost, standby units, for example, and had to be low maintenance, the lower cost. And sustainability was a big issue for us. And at that time, I said, okay, we're going to do this project. We had an updated figure, remember,
yes,
of the National Gallery and Museum of Civilization. And I said, we're going to do it at 2/3 of the cost. And everybody said, you know. And so that was our objective on economics. And
This whole complex came in at 220, is it? 220? Something
well,
like
it was 218.
a square foot. And it's virtually the same as a high school, you know. And even in those days, that was
Well, and
something.
you know, National Gallery was $350 a square foot, so
Yeah.
we were pretty close to 2/3. So this was our first of the final sketches. And those are Morse code, you know, lest we forget, in both French and English.
This is the wall that I got a phone call at 9 o'clock at night from Joe Gertz, who said, I got a call from a journalist of the Citizen or the Globe, I'm not sure, and who said, oh, the construction's going up and you haven't spelt, lest we forget, correct in the Morse code. Wow.
Yeah, we were in a panic.
Yeah.
Then we realized that a contractor had put a board on one section of that roof, and so
Yes, they had leaned the board up over one of the dots or dashes. Luckily, everything was fine. And I always remember Mark O'Neill at the time was not as he is now, the president of the Museum of Civilization, which includes the War Museum. And he was a secretary to the board. And he came and he says, Alec, I'll take this. I'm getting more calls from MPs in every direction saying, if this is wrong, sue the architects. So he calmed everything down. Thank goodness there was no error.
well, I have to tell you, honestly, we never got sued on anything on this project. And these were other sketches that start to say, to tell the client that one side is urban, but the other side, this end, was more pastoral. And, you know, we just had to illustrate this because, you know, getting words like, wow, you gotta be porous, open, all that, is wonderful, you know, architectural jargon, but the reality is, you know, one side is not urban. One side is. So, and we wanted people to traverse across the roof, like in nature. So there are ramps that go up, and inspired by the soldiers marching. And this is Colville's painting. Very important because it shows that the soldiers always had this idea that the safest is to be in the middle of 9-meter grid. 9 meter, 4.5 meter on one side, 4.5 meter. So from that, and it so happened that the 9-meter grid is most economical construction in concrete. So the War Museum is based on 9-meter grid. And you'll see the impact of that. And I think it's the only building that has a signature in Morse code in both English and
French.
French. And this is something that we want the War Museum to do in the future, to give that sort of sense of.
This is very important. On the way up the traverse, there's a conceptual idea that Raymond had of this sort of thing, which was reminiscent of being in a trench in World War I. It hasn't been done yet, but we haven't given up.
No. I hope you insist. So, and this Hall of Remembrance is crucial to the idea. Just ask yourself, what is the moment when all Canadians come together? It's Remembrance Day, at 11 o'clock. There's a moment of silence, and we're all together as a nation. And so we spent a considerable amount of time, and including, asking NASA to sort of help us figure out where the light from the sun is going to shine at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of November.
And I have to interject there, because once Raymond had tracked it down, there was somebody in the office who deliberately followed that.
Jason worked on it, yeah.
There was the point of how long will this last? In other words, that the sun will come through to this location and go into that hall and give light right to the headstone of the unknown soldier. So somebody in the museum here, whose name I can't remember, actually took it upon themselves to find out. And they said, well, Alec, you and Raymond, would you mind that it won't go offline from this until at least 1,500 years, 1,500 years to maybe 2,000. And I think we were happy about that.
These are the original sketches that was starting to track the location of what we called 11, 11, 11. And we had this mast going up, and in the clear direction of this particular moment in time. And it was designed so that it's like a harp, and that moves and sort of makes the sound. Unfortunately, it was never built.
We've only the short column. It should have gone through into a stainless steel mast. They decided NCC would like it, but the War Museum just insisted that the budget was not able to take it. So that's it. You couldn't do it.
I'm kind of strong on this. I thought it was the most stupid decision of $30,000. Now it'll cost, maybe 10 times or even more
easy
to do
10
it.
times
And
plus.
they said, well, we'll do it later. Well, wonderful. The grass is growing on the roof. And
this is just at the beginning. As anyone knows now, if you climb over the traverse this summer, the grass grew right up to this height. And I was happy to say that a couple of people in Raymond's office actually sent me some slides to show that the grass could be seen over the parapet edge, which is something I always particularly liked. They loved, of course, the fact that the grass got quite like straw this year because we had such a drought. But thanks to Raymond's landscape firm, who really had thought quite carefully about this, that the irrigation system would help to keep this alive under pretty severe conditions. And this was, in its day, I think, one of the first major green roofs in Canada.
Well, I don't know whether, if we were one of the first, but it's a good insulation, and it helps to conserve the energy. And if you look at the plan of the museum, it's very compact, and that helps to keep the energy. The sunset at equinox was a very important sort of a consideration, and if you get a chance during the equinox, like March 21st, September 21st, go out and have a look. If it's a sunny day, see where the sunset is. These were early models of the landscaping. And there's a representation of Beaumont Hamel.
It's also now, I think, quite special. We didn't think about this at the time. We wanted the roof originally to go right the whole way up, but we had to save money, change the structure to steel on the east side of the building, so that we thought it would be great if it was all concrete. People could walk up there and everything. But that didn't come to pass. However, this side here, which is on the west side, is all concrete. And the War Museum is very generous and, I think, very bright thinking in using it, such as the Blues Festival. Both the commons and the roof of the building, as well as the theater, are used for other activities. And that, I think, is extremely good. And I feel, we all feel, Raymond and I and the offices feel very good that it isn't just sitting there, and there isn't just the museum. There's other activities using it. But as I said, I don't think we thought of a jazz festival or ooze joint staggered boarding. It was a material, for instance, that Corbusier particularly used in Chandragar, and also he used it at Harvard in the Carpenter Center, but it didn't come off that way. He said, it's too perfect. The concrete there is too perfect. And he wrote about that to the Harvard University. We felt that it was important that the concrete could be rough and textured, because this is a war museum. It's not a pristine art gallery. And I think that helped psychologically and spiritually with the building, but it also worked to help with the budget.
Well, it was interesting because we had Tony Belay heading up the concrete work. And I said, Tony, what I want is a magical imperfection. And what is a magical imperfection? Well, and so Tony did it.
He did.
And how to pour 2 layers of concrete wall on a slope. And that was something that, Earl Rankin could tell you. It was quite a job.
Well, we were with the 3 designs and coming to this refinement, we were thinking it would be nice to be granite or something or so on. And then we suddenly, of course, found out very quickly that there was nowhere near a budget that could do it. And then we thought of precast, but Ray and I were both not happy too well about precast. My former partner, Pat Murray, did a brilliant building at Ottawa U, the engineering building, with superb quality of precast with very good aggregate. But we couldn't afford that here. So it would be just like paving stones stuck as a wall. And Tony came in and met Raymond and I, and he felt that he also owed a lot of his life to Canada. And he came along, and he knew from, at that time, PCL were already on board as a construction manager. And he competed against that simple precast. And we're really glad that he won, because it's the integrity of the rough sawn concrete is a very key aspect to the whole project.
Yeah. Well, I was concerned about the budget, but I was more concerned about imperfection that is perfect. And the idea of producing something because it's cheaper was not the aim, but something that's sort of a nudge people and say, is this something that moves you? And that's the direction we went. Okay, we're walking inside. We're taking too much time, I think, the front door. And the museum is organized in a very simple manner. It's very tight together, separated by the public space. One side is the paying side, and one side is the free side. And it was as simple as that.
If it had been according to the program, it would be an enlarged corridor, the lobby. And Raymond, with his experience from other museums, argued that somehow or other you've got to find some real space. The foyer has to be huge, it has to be large, and you can then use other activities, like we're all going there to have a drink afterwards, but for all sorts of things, that lobby. The other reason argued was the NCC said, we would like that, and we'll help to contribute to that public space in order that the public, when LeBreton Flats develops with residential, can actually come through the corridor, or the foyer, I should say, through to the other side to the river. And that was an interesting combination, in fact, a fortuitous combination and support from the NCC.
Well, this is what Alex is talking about, to be able to have the public go right through the museum, open from the north as well as from the south. And of course, we were interested in getting a passageway to the island, eventually hoping that the island and Domtar will come down and start exposing that wonderful Chaudière Fall, and maybe something exciting, like more exciting than Granville sort of island in Vancouver. Now the foyer, and we couldn't draw what we wanted, and this is the best we were able to do, because I was trying to express that lady's comment about going to war is like going to the depths of hell, to resurrect the soul.
Originally, too, middle of the foyer outside should be lower than the doors at both ends in order that you come in and go down. A bit like if you've been to Saarinen gateway, you'll find that's the entrances, brilliantly done. And that was suiting Raymond's context of compression, both from the ceiling and by dropping in the floor. Unfortunately, the rock was slightly higher than we anticipated, and the budget couldn't take doing that. So we had to essentially live with a level floor completely through the main foyer.
Well, but if,
with a bit of
most people will realize that the floor is a bit much more bumpy than a level floor. And, you know, the sense of going into some, you know, the depths of hell was sort of expressed. Then when the sun comes out, it's quite different. And this is the entry into the Hall of Remembrance. It's a narrow triangular space. And these were
you heard Raymond mention about 9 meters. This is a 9-meter cube. And it's the only orthogonal piece in the whole complex.
The copper is absolutely, you know, amazing. Who was it helped us get this copper?
Well, it was it was a very interesting story, but I'll try to keep it short. Bruce Lorimer, at that time, was the director of Public Works here in Ottawa, and he was therefore had influence on what was happening up in Parliament because they were stripping the roof off the library after 60 years. Copper only lasts about 60 years. And he said, would you like some of the old copper? And I remember...
It took a little more than getting them to ask us. We worked on it for a couple of years to get this.
Yes. and of course, a few of the, like General Manson and a few of the other people who had been in the fundraising for the building, because there was a large public support for this building, they were ecstatic at the idea of something from Parliament Hill being able to be used in the War Museum. So we came up with the idea of using it as a cladding, not realizing what it was going to really look like. And it's absolutely fantastic. There was a lot of work by coppersmiths to pick, and they choose the way the pattern is there. And one of them said to me one day, oh, I have a piece here. My old uncle worked on the original 60 years ago. So I remember telling Joe Gertz this, and he phoned the Minister of Public Works. We had a special ceremony to thank them and to say with the new copper, which is on Generation Hall, you'd better make sure and sign it so that 60 years from now, that copper will be understood by the next copper trade.
So what was important here is to make that social connection. You know, like too many, you know, architecture doesn't make that social connection. And in this case, it was not only the social connection, but also the connection of time and connection of the War Museum with the Peace Tower and the library. And so it was bridging a lot of sort of a space. And the Hall of Remembrance I'll just go through this quickly. Oh, by the way, we use 15% fly ash, which is free, and mixed it with concrete to get this sort of a moldy look. And the pattern is exactly the same size as the enlarged version of the tomb of the unknown soldier. And this is what the sun does. And on November 11, the light comes in, and this is a shot that I can't remember who took, but it's exactly at 11:11:11. It frames the unknown soldier completely. And the unknown soldier, the tomb, is mounted at the average height of a Canadian soldier.
As I said, there's nothing orthogonal except that Remembrance Hall. And all this rough concrete in Commissioner's Way, both inside and outside, was very much part of developing the project. We made samples of this concrete, big samples, and we put them against a rock face, the client came and all sorts of people and had a look at it. And I always particularly remember Victor Rabinovich, who at that time was the CEO of the Museum of Civilization, took one look at it and said, "Are you proposing that that is the finish in the building?" And I remember saying, "Yes," and I went waxing on all about concrete. Typical architect. And he said, "Well," he said, "I'll tell you one thing, you're Irish, you'll never give up, but I'll tell you what, build it that way, I'll approve it, but if I don't like it, we can paint it white."
Well, of course I said, "No bloody way."
So he has since, before he retired, at one of the soirees here, he made a statement about this and said, "Alec, I won't be painting it white. It looks fine."
And if you notice, the sunlight comes in, and we purposely jiggled the window frame so that the refraction is not completely the same. Yes, so, some will come directly in, others are slightly off. And if they were the same, it's almost monotonous. The structural module, we talked about it. The exhibits were done by others. And this is the LeBreton flat sort of area. And this is a pre-design. And we made numerous models of the edge condition to see how you could sort of integrate the floor, the window, and the ceiling.
Again, when we designed originally, as Raymond was saying, this was for the machines, tanks, all sorts of things. And it was the museum here who thought up the idea that this would be a great pleasure to have a hall, a special, because it's a special space. The view of downtown Ottawa was quite fabulous. So they've edged and pushed all the tanks and things back, not what we originally had anticipated, and got this found space. Not only is it found, but they have gatherings in it and make money with it, which is quite entrepreneurial. I'm a strong supporter of what they've done to make money, this museum, as opposed to just sitting and expecting the taxpayers to keep on forking out without any return.
Well, the acoustics was really a important part of our design. Like this, go back. This space was designed and acoustically treated so that when you're in there, and if you listen to music like Glenn Miller or Artie Shaw, or early jazz in the 1920s, it would reverberate a little bit, and it would feel like a music that's played during the World War II in a hangar or open space. And the same thing applied to the acoustics in the foyer. I designed it to Wagner's Ring opera, and so that you get this sort of sense of bit heaviness. Regeneration Hall. Again, I use that.
This, by the way, I have to interject to say, is Raymond's special space. After the three designs that that Raymond had illustrated earlier and mentioned, the landscape scheme was the one that edged that little more on the 31 to 32%. And the committee of the Museum of Civilization particularly liked the landscape. But they said, we've got to have a feature. Can you put an elevator up or do this or that? I mean, the view of Parliament and all this sort of thing. And of course, we pointed out the difficulties for that type of thing. And we went away to try and think of what could we do. And Dermot Nash and I came up with ideas, and Raymond went off home for a few days, came back with this regeneration hall. So we tore up our sketches and said, that's it.
Well, the thing is, I didn't want a tower, because so many war museums have this kind of a look to it. We're going to get them kind of approach. And I always felt that, I imagine myself inside a mountain in the Rockies and looking out. And so I made this sketch of myself inside this mountain looking out and the sunlight coming into the inner sort of space of the mountain. And of course, Lauren Harris's sort of a painting was an inspiration. And so the idea was, and I guess at the time, I think our structural engineers thought we were crazy because I was asking for a structure that is wobbly. I want a wobbly structure. And, basically, coming out with maybe a 3-point support.
When Graham Rubley heard this first, he nearly had a fit. You mean you want a structure to look like it'll fall down? But he got right into it.
Yeah, well, but what we did was a bit brilliant, I think. We took the stair, escape stair that was necessary by law, and we made it into a regeneration hall.
Yep.
The client couldn't object to it, and it avoided this, monstrous tower.
Yeah.
With the
Naturally,
elevator.
we had said to the client that, well, if you want this, this is the design. They love the idea of Raymond's concept for Regeneration Hall. How much is it? And he said 3 million odd. And they said, well, we don't have it. You're going to have to find the money from the budget of the building. Right?
Yep. The light that comes through, is spelling out the lest we forget in French and English on the other side, and it constantly changes as day goes on, and you could see through. We couldn't take a picture with a tower, Peace Tower, but because of the light. But at the base of this glazing is a sculpture of Howard's hope. And so it focuses on the idea of hope. And if you go into the space and walk down the stairs, and when you walk on that floor, I'm sure that virtually 95% of you will think it's slightly tilted. The whole thing is play on optical illusion.
This is a very good point to mention. The cladding there, which is corrugated steel with little holes in it. During construction, it went on after the main structure, and it was winter, and there was this eerie sound coming through this. And I said to Raymond, and who was coming up in a couple of days' time, and he said, oh, I got to hear that. So you'll notice what he said about sound, even from his first sketch. So when he came and he heard this, he said, this is fabulous. We've got to record this. And Joe Gertz sent in special recording, because you can't just set up a regular tape thing, and recorded it, and that's what you hear playing in the hall when you enter that space from the upper level.
Well, when I heard it, it was slightly more metallic than the sound I was remembering from age 12. But it was getting, I felt it's close enough. And so I went in search of Joe Gertz, who was leading a group of people fundraising. And I said, Joe, you got to record it. And I felt really badly that I was so abrupt and all that. And I didn't think Joe would do it. And he always knew that, like sound of nature is better than people talking or reading words that people create. So that hall has a little sign saying that it's the sound that was recorded at that particular time, and I think it works well. So we were aspiring for the spirit of Canadians and hope. So we were trying to bridge nature, city, and the parliament. So
I think don't know how that happened.
well, so the basic theme was regeneration.
Yeah.
And I think that's the end. I'm
Yes.
glad you're here.
Thanks, Raymond and Alex, for such an honest and intimate discussion. And you really helped to demonstrate tonight the complexity of the architectural imagination and all of the twists and turns that are necessary in order to get a great building built. Everything from budget to idea to very innovative construction technology. I had the opportunity to visit the building a couple of times while it was under construction. And you underplayed that a little bit tonight, you mentioned it, but there's some really quite remarkable technical achievements in this building as well. So I'd like to open up the floor for some questions at this point. We have a microphone here. Any takers? Thanks, Bridget.
Yes, nowadays on Remembrance Day, we often hear about veterans who come back to Canada without a recognition of their role or their culture. And it seems that the War Museum was such a recognition. And I would like to know what feedback you received from that one group of users. The feedback from the veterans, each one.
Oh,
Or what it meant to them.
very
or
positive.
what you see out of it.
What I didn't mention is that the War Museum is about basically 3 periods of time. The past, and that's to honor the Canadians who gave their lives or, gave of themselves to Canada. And today is the point where, we all live in sort of get affected, not only by the past, but, what the hell is the future? And the future is about hope. And so the veterans were never forgotten. It was always a part of the concept. And well, I don't know about Alec, but I've been getting pretty positive response from the veterans. For me, it was interesting because at the beginning, when the project was, we were commissioned, I think a lot of veterans wondered why in the hell, Mariyama got the job. Why wasn't it Smith or Jones? But nothing like that ever occurred after the project was finished. So, it's an interesting period of time I lived through.
The veterans, during the process right through into construction, were very much involved. The reason, too, partly, of course, was fundraising. So the committee of the veterans who raised $14 million for this building. The government had promised that if you hadn't raised that 14 million, we'll cover it until you raise it. And only halfway through the campaign, they already had the 14 million. Now, some of those are large banks, a few things, but the majority of that money is individual veterans. They were so happy to have a fully national war museum. What we also found from Americans are jealous because they don't have a national war museum. And that word gets around. And so whoever helped to make this all happen really paved the way for the project's success. Like, we're part of a whole slew of people over many, many years. And Chrétien, for instance, we both saw him twice, right? And Peter, my son, was with us, and he did the PowerPoint, of course. And Chrétien said, and we brought a model, a balsa wood model. And he said, oh, put it on the desk. And we said, well, that's McDonald's desk. And he said, that's all right. He would like the idea. So we put it on. And when we found out that he was originally slated to become an architect, and his father persuaded him to do law instead, to which Raymond very quickly said,
Well, Chrétiens wanted to be an architect. You know, he admitted this at one of the grand opening of a project. He looked at me eyeball to eyeball and said, you know, I wanted to be an architect. But my father said to me, John, you know, how are you going to make a living as an architect? He said, be a lawyer and a politician and you'll do okay. And he said, I listened to my father. So when
but
we
secretly he always wanted to be an architect.
So that's why he was very interested in this. And so when I met Chrétien in the Parliament building, I said, you know, remember you're saying this at this opening? He said, yes. So I said, well, I told our sons never to get into this crazy business called architecture. They didn't listen to me. Said, but now I'm very happy that they didn't listen to me. And so he said, oh, I understand that.
I've seen groups of veterans come into the building in the early days and just weep. And that is very moving, to be part of something that does that.
So does that answer your question?
Any other questions?
You may not have seen what the German pulled during does it work? Wait. During the Second World War, the German built what they call the Mur de l'Atlantique, the Atlantic Wall, which was fortress Europe to defend Europe from the invasion of the US and the British. And the museum that you have created here, if you have seen the structure, the huge concrete walls that the Germans built along the coast, around Dunkerque and the pas de Calais, it would be interesting for you to look at it. Perhaps if you look at a film, there are some film which shows some of those walls, and what you have created here very much reminds me of what the German built on the coast to create fortress Europe. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say, we were conscious of those towers, and there's another concrete inspiration which is just up the river here in Ottawa, just going west. I remember going with Raymond to the changing pavilions that Jim Strutt designed in concrete. They're like wigwams. And that was in our early days, and we said, gee, yeah, there's some really good, interesting concrete buildings around here on the river's edge, and people were quite inspired. We were quite inspired by the concrete and the Martello towers. I've seen the ones particularly in Nova Scotia, where they set up the protection. and also in Jersey, which actually were German ones, against the bridge.
We were very sensitive to the Ontario-Quebec sort of a situation, and we could have done a design that would sort of look like a fortress fighting off the French on the other side of the river, and we were very sort of careful to avoid all that, and that's why we played a lot with nature and the equinox and the sun setting, and so that it's not an offensive project to either Ontario or to Quebec. Does that make any sense to you?
Another question? One more question? Barry?
It's not a question. It's interesting because Alex and Ray are together. Alex was the one who got me involved with the REIC, and in, I think it's 98, Ray won the gold medal in architecture, and he gave a little talk we were in Montreal. One of the things that we always want to know with these lecture series is how young architects, they want to know what good architects, what caused them to get into architecture. And in that talk, and this sort of related to the whole war thing, because I think Ray gave a little vignette about his life, why the very seminal moment that caused him to want to become an architect. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Ray, I don't know, there's a construction going on across the street, and there's something about you being interested in building at that point in time. So my question to you, and in a very weird way, I'm wondering if that event actually happened in an internment camp. I'm not sure, but obviously what I'm interested in you conveying to the very young architects is that moment where you said, I'd like to become an architect.
Well, very good question. Fortunately, or unfortunately, at age 4, I nearly died of a bad scalding. And I was spent 8 months in bed. What my father did was, in order to keep me in touch with the outside world, he sort of put a cot beside the window looking out onto the street. And I watched this, it was a little construction going on across the street. And every once in a while, this, in my head, a good-looking architect with a pipe and a row of drawings under his arm would come to the site, and there was a big rock on the site beside the construction. He would unroll these drawings, and all the working people would gather around him, and every time he sort of said something, and he would puff on his pipe, and ooh, and I thought, whoa, wow, gee, he's magical, and everybody likes him. Well, you had different experience. Well, so I said to my dad, can you go across the street and find out who that guy is? Who that man is? So my dad immediately went across and talked to this man and talked to the other people in construction and came back and he said, he's called an architect. And then he said, his name is such and such. Well, I didn't care about the name. And I said, I'm going to be an architect. So at 4.5 years old, that was it. That was the decision. Then there was a question of, because those days was quite different in Canada. And the question was for me, how do I become an architect? Because it was difficult for a Japanese Canadian to get into a university. And to be an architect, I felt I had to go to a university. But it was easier to become a doctor than anything else. So my parents wanted me to be a doctor. But I just, shrink as soon as I see blood. And so, I thought about that for a long, long time. And of course, I felt, if you're going to be an architect, you got to, as my mother said, you have to work 5 times harder than the average person. And it was virtually all hard work, really. And that was the beginning.
The spark for me was a bit later than Raymond's 4-year-old. I was 11 or 12. And every year, my parents had taken me to Scotland for holidays in the summer. And I used to love traveling over the Forth Bridge. And my father said, I've got a book you must have to look at about the Forth Bridge. And I said, yeah, it's wonderful, but I don't want to be an engineer. I'd rather be an artist, So he said, I'll show you this book. And in it, it showed that it was an architect who actually developed the conceptual design for the Forth Bridge. The engineers then followed and made it real and stand up, but it was an architect. So I thought, yeah, that's not bad. I think I could enjoy that type of architect. Of course, I've never reached that level. I think that's the level that even Raymond and I would talk about in the sense of that's Calatrava or Nervian, another earlier generation. A brilliant marriage of engineering and art. And that's... But once you've bitten the world of architecture, it becomes a day and light obsession. And even now, as a recently retired architect, I still wouldn't change my life that I had and all the people I met and the architecture and working with it and so on.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
You made some reference to the solstice. I'd like to know where that comes from, because you all know how the solstice is involved in the City Hall, because you designed it. But I notice you're almost married to it. You might explain to people how that comes about.
Well, it's an interesting question, but I'm not quite sure I understood exactly what you're asking.
Oh, I'm sorry. You recall in the City Hall, what is now the City Hall, you have a small window up in the rotunda. You remember?
Oh.
And that's tied in with the winter solstice. But while I have the microphone, never giving them an opportunity, Every year I have a solstice party in your name.
Well, is that right? What did you discover? No, that was our granddaughter, the oldest granddaughter, was born on March 21st. So that little piece was dedicated to her. And on equinox, if the sun is out, it brings in the light. And the glass is a special glass. At nighttime, it changes to something more like a moon. And during the day, it turns into a sun and casts a different kind of light. So I haven't seen the actual sort of performance on, and I've been meaning to come down on sunny, March 21st to see what I refer to as Jessica. That's our granddaughter's name, Does that answer your question? Well.
All right, with that, I'd like to suggest that we call the evening to a close. Again, I'd like to thank Raymond Mariyama and Alex Rankin for, again, a really wonderful evening. Thanks for sharing this with us.